Path of Exile had rather tremendous news, and it's news that was actually quite surprising. The idea that Grinding Gear Games are going to be simultaneously running two action RPGs, Path of Exile 1 and Path of Exile 2, at the same time, with, between the two of them, one season every 1.5 months, is tremendously ambitious. And it's partially, as well, an attempt for them to not run into what you could perhaps call the Overwatch 2 problem. And I don't bring this up just to bash Blizzard, it's the simple fact that doing a sequel to a multiplayer game, again, the same thing happened in, say, Destiny, is really quite challenging. With Overwatch 2, the pivots on what they were initially trying to do with 2, over to what they ended up doing, obviously disappointed fans. Yes, it means that Overwatch 2 actually exists, but people were tremendously let down. You then look at Destiny. I was there at the launch of Destiny 2. I was really having a blast. It was all quite new and exciting. But for those people who had played Destiny 1, seen it through its whole life, they were actually profoundly disappointed because so many of the incredible positive moves that happened over the lifespan of Destiny 1 were just not there in 2 when it came out. And so this happens again and again and again. Even between Diablo 3 and Diablo 4, they're very different games. D3 is far more fast-paced. To be honest with you, the campaign and level up experience, if I'm just doing it a few times, I think I prefer Diablo 4. But for a lot of that turbo endgame grinding, I'm almost feeling that I'd kind of prefer the speed of D3. So what do you do in your company? Can you try to have it both ways? That is what Grinding Gear Games have absolutely tried to do this time. Path of Exile 2 was announced in 2019. At the time, it was supposed to be an expansion of the base game that would be developed alongside Path of Exile. Their plan was to have both of the campaigns playable within the same game, and for them to essentially have a shared endgame experience. But then what happened? Well, development, things grew, new mechanics, new classes, and a bunch of other features that ended up being planned. And this is a kind of growth that would see the first game be adversely impacted because it just couldn't stay the same, right? And while you can see how that's a good enough plan, just saying, hey, we're going to bolt a bunch more content onto this and we're all going to be very excited, that's a good plan. But the problem is the development happened. As they developed the game, they made new mechanics, new classes, and other features. And they essentially realized that, well, these features are no longer that compatible with Path of Exile 1. PoE 1 would be destroyed by these structural changes, and that is exactly, speaking to Rock Paper Shotgun, what the creative director of Path of Exile said. Effectively, it would be destroying PoE 1 if we did our original plan, and we didn't want to do that. And that's interesting to me. I've seen quite a few people talk about how Path of Exile 2 was, at ExileCon, perhaps a little bit overtuned, but that it did seem to be less of a speed kind of experience. Which again reminded me of Diablo 4 versus 3. D3, very zoomy, very speedy. D4, definitely a bit more slowed down and methodical. So where Blizzard and many other companies end up, yes, making that sacrifice and just moving on with the new thing, Grinding Gear are quite evidently trying to have their cake and eat it too. Which is always a silly turn of phrase because, hey, if you've got cake, why not eat it? I can come up with several compelling reasons, but let's move on with the story. The good thing about this then, with Path of Exile 2 now being a full standalone game, is that it still does have a lot of its shared game experience DNA. As an example, every single thing that players have purchased or will purchase in the future will be usable in both games, unless it's the sort of thing that is like so specific that it, just like wouldn't tie at all into the content of one of the other games. Now, they did suggest that the narrative content of Path of Exile 1 will be ending. The campaign of 2 is a direct continuation of that. However, leagues will still be designed. They will be made for the original game, and I believe they will be holding their 3-month cadence, which means that between both of those games, you now have a season every 1.5 months, or at least that seems to be the plan. That is pretty damn crazy, especially when you think that actually PoE 1 seasons are pretty chunky. I mean, I took a look at Crucible lately, And it's actually quite impressive. Certainly to me it was impressive compared to Season of the Malignant in Diablo 4. So let's actually take a look then at the features of Path of Exile 2. And speaking of features, our game, yes, we're also a game development studio, The Pale Beyond, was actually featured by Steam on a daily deal, and because of that, it's currently 25% off. We've been above 90% on Steam for ages, people really seem to be happy, and we just dropped a free content update that adds a whole bunch of epilogues, which essentially means the fates of all the core characters that you care about will be there, will be elaborated on, and in a way that is very reactive to the choices you make and the endings that you get in the game. So you can check out the Steam link. And with that said, Path of Exile 2 features. So, footage was shown from Act 3 of the game, and that's 3 out of a total of 6 acts. Now, the gameplay had 2 classes. Monk, which is Dex and Int based, more of a kind of like resource management in the form of power charges, which are generated and then used in different abilities. Gotta say, I really do think that some of the animations and stuff for the Monk are, they're just really impressive to me. I kind of love those almost like airbender swoops. So, Monk looking good to me. We then have Sork, which of course is Int focused, more about destructive abilities versus the Witch that was previously in the game. Now they also then showed off Ascendancy classes for everyone, with class specific paths, 3 for each, which will basically allow for a whole bunch of personalization by the time you're actually hitting the end game. We've then got fairly interesting changes to core combat mechanics, and for the casters, they're all getting free base spells in each weapon rather than a melee attack that of course takes up an attack mod space. The developers also want to open up the game to allow for different weapon decisions and elemental impacts, with weapon sets and passive buffs being able to be matched to skills. As an example, whenever you use an ice spell, your character will automatically switch to the better weapon set. And for melee combat, I think this is one of the big things. Melee combat, it's punchy, it's fun, but whenever your pathfinding and stuff is a bit wonky, you do have issues. So they say they're actually moving their melee combat model towards mobility and control as a focus, and this is going to include better pathfinding for skills to ensure that people basically aren't really frustrated by complex environments or bad pathing, wasting their abilities. At the end of the day, the last thing anyone wants is for their character to control like the horse from Diablo 4, because man, it's a pretty bad horse as far as video game horses go. Now, they're also working on crowd control. Here's a really good quote. In Path of Exile 2, all crowd control mechanics now have internal meters that allow you to build up to a freeze or stun, or whatever other CC mechanic you're using. It's a little bit like poise from games like Elden Ring, though the meters tend to be a lot smaller. Every character now has a dodge roll. It also lets you cancel out of almost any skill at any time, which to me does sound quite good and fun. Now, to move on, in terms of rewards, bosses have got the ability to provide a permanent stat bonus upon defeat, and there's over 100 of them, with each area of the campaign having a boss and some unique mechanics. And even just looking at their trailers, those bosses actually did look really cool. Now, those areas are also going to have nice quality of life features, where a player can summon NPCs to their location in order to allow the player to manage quests without having to return back to town. Which is, again, sounds really nice to me. Again, with Diablo 4, I enjoyed the big open world and all of that when I was doing my level up content. I've actually found that I'm enjoying it less and less as time goes on, and that it more is starting to feel like a slow and inefficient menu to access content, which of course is, one of the inherent issues that you tend to run into when you are going for, a big fixed, open world game. Now, there's also changes to stats and casting in the addition of Spirit as a resource, where Spirit is basically designed to allow people to activate passive abilities and skills without burning mana to implement them. There was an example they gave here called Arctic Armor as an ongoing buff for the Sorcerer class. This essentially will build over time, but it doesn't impact any other casting. And the idea here is that players will be able to experiment with ongoing buffs, and they shouldn't be punished for having to want both, essentially. So this is kind of freeing up builds to use heralds or as minions. It seems neat to me. I keep on finding when I'm building a character that there's things I'd like to experiment with that sound fun, but to me, I constantly feel like the skill tree is maybe nudging me towards I mean, nudging me towards like glass cannon. Obviously that was a bit weird in D4 because of how the resistances worked and how like it was pretty OP when you could just stack a bunch of armor stuff. Anyway, I digress. It does seem like a fairly interesting mechanical twist and things. Everyone is going to start with 100 spirit, but of course different effects use different amounts of spirit, so essentially you can kind of like use a loadout of those like different buffs and things. So it seems pretty cool. And itemization wise, scepters are your in your offhand slot. Those are the things that will be like the quickest way to get more spirit. They're also changing how gems work in the game. Skill gems now drop as uncut gems that will allow the player to select a skill that matches the level of the area they received the gem in, and this should allow for more player control. This is in particular with meta gems, which can have a skill socket into them to allow for very ridiculous combos. So you can put gems in your gems, which seems cool. So basically overall then, I think the thing with Path of Exile 2, and I guess this is one of the ways where it really is justifying itself as a different experience, it is that they're making things meaningfully different in terms of how the game actually works. It doesn't seem like just a bunch of classes added to Path of Exile 1. No, it is a different passive mechanics that will result in a game that I suppose does feel different to play. Now, as for when we'll be able to try this, there's going to be a beta in June of 2024. So still pretty much a calendar year away from now. One thing that they are noting here is their plans for the beta are very, very comprehensive. So here's a big quote. "It'll be the whole game, and we're going to run it for as long as we would run a league, at least, so months, so that we know for sure what the economy looks like, what everything looks like once it really shakes out." So essentially, they're really focused on the actual core game experience. And to me, this is an interesting point of contrast with Diablo 4. D4 wasn't really giving people that extremely full testing period, right? It was more targeted slices to stress test servers and that kind of thing. Grinding Gear basically just said, yeah, we know we can handle the servers. The thing that we want to get right is like balance and the economy. And of course, you look at D4 and the likes of balance, player usability, and endgame. Those have been the major points of feedback, right? It's like D4 is, I think, at its best when you're kind of like leveling up, you know, in your first character. It's when you hit the end game, subsequent characters and that kind of thing, that I think D4 maybe slows down a bit and I think weakens as an experience. So it is quite interesting to me what the focus of their testing is. I suppose in this case, this is a game that is made by developers who have been really shipping lots of live product for years and years and years and years. And yes, that had been happening with D3, but D3 seasons, you know, they weren't as big, right? It wasn't a big, like, free-to-play, you know, decently monetized game. Blizzard, I think, had less of an incentive there. So you do just get, I think, a lot of the good vibes here. And I think a lot that does, at least to me, feel like it is targeted at alleviating the sorts of problems that, say, D4 has had in terms of design quibbles from the period of its, like, you know, its launch into. I mean, realistically, for Diablo 4, I think it will be the end of Season 2 that we really start to see things coming along. And I mean, personally, for me, I'm going to want to see more interesting endgame things going on in D4, and certainly when I look at a bunch of the leagues in Path of Exile, it does seem that that is a more fleshed out endgame experience. Now, if Blizzard are not going to be adding anything like that until the next expansion, then to me it's almost like with D3 all over again, where, you know, D3 as an endgame experience to me was only really fun in Reaper of Souls, when they added so much of that love to the loot system and like the endgame experience. I feel like D4 is missing out in the endgame experience right now. Yeah. Quite funny. And I suppose on that, like, yeah, to talk about competition in this space, there's quite a few. I actually hear Grim Dawn's got some new stuff going on. I think we all remember, was it Wilson? It's not like last year. ARPGs, there's quite a few of them just blow up for a few weeks, and then you don't hear as much about them. Obviously, D4 is the big thing, and they have actually made some comment just saying that they empathize with the team, especially regarding expectations around a first season and patches. They said, I mean, ultimately the learning process for running a live game with seasons like this is a hard one. We've learned our lessons about how to do this stuff. I feel very bad for the developers because I'm sure they mean well, but yeah, it's a hard lesson to learn. I think the entire internet has been aware of that, even with, I mean, the PC Gamer tweet that was like, how it started, how it is now, and it was just a perfectly timed screenshot of one of the D4 developer streams where just no one was looking at the camera and everyone looked really depressed. That was a state where it's like, oh man, your heart goes out, to those developers. Management, and I mean, some of them are management, but they're being rolled out almost every week to do a live stream to firefight some problem. Oh dear, the poor bastards. Really though, I think a lot of the distinctions between these games becomes apparent when we actually just listen to what Jonathan Rogers says, because he was quite keen to downplay the way in which Diablo 4 can be compared to Path of Exile, right? He was quite keen to talk about PoE, how it's taking a different path. That doesn't mean that they'll be particularly similar experiences. And he kind of talked about D4 and the MMO path, right? Which, massively multiplayer online. And in many ways, that's what Diablo 4 is. And I think the bit where, as a player, I found D4 to be a little confusing is that it is this odd hybrid, right? Because in one way, it's feeling kind of MMO-like. It's like, hey, there's a Helltide over there. All the players are going to come and do the Helltide, and you'll do it in a big world, and that can be quite fun, You go to do an event, a bunch of other people, you run into them, you all do the event together. But then, to me, that starts to create more of a Lost Ark-like expectation where I can have a character, I can get that character to endgame, and then I personally would almost expect, and again, I'm not saying it should be like this, but some of the design decisions of Diablo 4 would make me personally expect that once I get my character to level 100, that I've kind of hit the end game of the MMO, and that from season to season, I'll get new content, new modifiers, new things, and that each season will sort of successively have better gear for my character in some way. Yet with Diablo 4, it feels like a lot of the design is making me expect that, but then the end game feels undercooked, and then the season is asking you to start over again. And I have done that. I've started a druid, I got a malignant heart that gives me more wolves, and I think now I have like 7 or 8 skill points out of 5 in the wolf thing, so I'm going around firing lightning everywhere with my wolves. And that is pretty good and fun, but also it's basically just leveling up again. And those of us who have played MMOs know that, you can level up characters for forever, but the thing that's probably going to make the game the most sticky is whenever you can maybe head back to your main and do a whole bunch of stuff at the end game. And D4 just doesn't really seem set up for that. It's not, because it's taking these more MMO-like things, but it's still sticking with the very seasonal action RPG thing. And I wonder then, with Path of Exile, are they just more embracing what they actually are and focusing on delivering the best version of that? Whereas going through the interview with Rock, Paper, Shotgun, I think what Rogers is really going towards is different inspirations, having a sort of different overall targeted game feel that they're trying to go for than D4, which means they're not particularly concerned about D4. Again, I remember, was it Torchlight and D3 coming out, and the Torchlight devs were just like, rising tide lifts all ships. If D4 gets a whole bunch of people back into an ARPG and they're hungry for more content and D4 isn't scratching the itch, and then they hear good buzz about Path of Exile, that's obviously amazing for Path of Exile. I suppose I find myself currently, based on what I've seen of PoE 2 and what I've now seen of PoE 1, it does seem like PoE 1, surprisingly as an ongoing game experience, maybe is actually more interesting to me. With D4, I really like the start, I really like the end. I think it got kind of boring in the middle. Personally, I was expecting the level of storytelling that was present in the introduction of Diablo 4. I was actually expecting that to be the campaign of the game, but instead I felt like the campaign was often quite watered down and open worldy in a way that, honestly, even a bit of Diablo Immortal was, which to me wasn't great, but then the ending was quite strong. However, looking at PoE, it does seem like it would be a more rewarding experience. So ultimately then, I am left absolutely wanting to jump into Path of Exile. I made a tweet about that. Is there anything I should know? Mike, of course, one of my colleagues over in the Warcraft scene, he's obviously less of a Warcraft guy now. He just tweeted at me do it blind, do not research. So I'm like, sure, all right, Mike, I'll do it. I'll jump in. I'll jump into PoE. it seems like it might actually have more to offer in terms of like build craft and unique experiences than D4. And I'm just finding that like, yeah, man, D4 is just a very slow experience. It's like the leveling is slow. It's like, I feel like I want to race my new character up and start getting into the meat of things, but I don't feel like it has that meat at the end game other than just doing the nightmare dungeons at a high tier with a bunch of affixes, which is like fun for a bit, yeah, but I kind of want more. So I'm left this video thinking Path of Exile looks like the game to play now that I've enjoyed D4 once. If a Diablo 4 season ends up really like surpassing expectations and actually having quite a bit of content, I'll definitely do that. But other than that, for D4, I suspect I might be waiting until the next expansion, and what that does in a sort of big sense for endgame systems, that might just be where I have to go. Okay, let me know what you think. What I certainly think is interesting thus far is the humongous expansion of the, maybe not expansion, but the action RPG genre is something that people are talking about so much now. I mean, fundamentally, that idea of buildcraft, fragging a stupid amount of mobs. To be honest, I even see a little reflection of that in, say, some of the buildcraft and mass slaughter of Vampire Survivors, which I think is all to say that buildcraft-based kill lots of dude games are in. I then wonder, how much fat can we trim and how much can we focus on the bits of the game that really excel that? Because with D4, I feel like there's a lot of open world pseudo MMO fat, but the game's not actually delivering a full pseudo MMO experience, which means that fat is more just of a downside. You look at then of Vampire Survivors and the whole Survivor genre, and it's like a really fine distillation of that, you know, instead of your, like, you know, you have characters, you have, you know, your items that you can build with, but like in terms of control and stuff like that, it is so much more of, you know, of a distilled experience. And then I think at the other end of that, you have Path of Exile. So to me, it's as if Vampire Survivors is a very approachable minimalist, almost approach to the get strong, kill many boys genre, whereas Diablo 4 is, I guess, just bogged down by trying to be a pseudo MMO. Why do they do that if they weren't intending to, like, actually embrace that? I don't know. TLDR, I'm left confused. If you'd like to buy our game, which is very much not like an action RPG, then you can check out The Pale Beyond. It's currently 25% off Steam. If you want to support our team at store.bellular.games, you've got the likes of our delicious, lovely art book, which is very awesome. And with that, let me know what your experience has been, especially if you have been. I mean, I've been in the MMO mine. I know many of you guys have been in the ARPG mine. So I will share with you my MMO experience and tales. Please share with me your ARPG tales. I want to learn. Have a wonderful day. I'll see you next time.